In the history of America, some stories are so horrific they become buried not by time, but by shame. This is the dark story of a woman who became a legend, a ghost whispered about in the sweltering heat of the Georgia night. She was known as the Black Widow, and in 1857, she began a macabre mission of vengeance that remains one of the most terrifying and mysterious serial killer cases in the nation's hidden history. Using little more than her wits and a razor, she seduced 17 overseers and slit their throats in their beds, one by one. She left no evidence, no witnesses, and was never caught. The white community believed they were being haunted by a demon. They never suspected the killer was a single, freed woman with a handwritten list. What drove her to such a terrifying act of justice, and how did she orchestrate a massacre so perfectly that she disappeared from history itself? This is the kind of dark secret that official records were designed to forget. If you believe these hidden histories deserve to be brought into the light, subscribe to Before the Story and enable all notifications so you never miss an investigation. Please like this video if you value these deep dives into our most unsettling past. And let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. The story does not begin in 1857, with the scent of blood on the humid Georgia air. It begins more than a century later, in 1968, with the sound of splintering wood and collapsing brick. Near the murky banks of the Ogeechee River, a demolition crew was tearing down the last remnants of a long-abandoned sharecropper's cabin. Inside the flue of a fallen chimney, a worker found something preserved against the slow decay of time. A small, leather-bound book, its pages brittle and stained. Inside, written in a hand of almost impossible elegance, was a list of 17 names. Beside each, a plantation and a date, and through each name a single decisive line of faded ink had been drawn. This artifact, now known as the Crane Ledger, is the only physical proof of the legend's reality. This ledger is the anchor in a sea of whispers. To understand its meaning, one must turn to other fragments scattered across the archives. There is a manumission record from Burke County, Georgia, dated November 1856, granting freedom to a woman named Marisol Crane upon the unforeseen passing of her owner. There are census records from 1860 where her name is conspicuously absent, as if she had been erased not just from the landscape, but from existence itself. She is a ghost in the official ledger, a missing person whose story can only be pieced together through the documents of the men who feared her, long before they ever knew her name or that she was even a woman at all. The setting for this dark tale is the borderland between Burke and Jefferson County, a place of oppressive heat, dense cypress swamps, and isolated plantations connected by winding dirt roads. In 1857, this was a region governed by fear, the ever-present fear of the enslaved and the simmering paranoid fear of the masters. Power was maintained through the brutal authority of the overseer, men chosen for their capacity for cruelty, who operated with near-total impunity. Their word was law, their whip was justice, and their violence was the engine that drove the entire economy. It was a world built on a fragile and brutal order, one that was about to be systematically dismantled from within. Before the first body was discovered, Marisol Crane was just another shadow moving along the periphery of this world. As a freed woman, she possessed a precarious and limited liberty, allowing her to travel between plantations seeking work as a cook, a laundress, or a seamstress. This mobility, a rarity for any person of color in the region, made her both visible and invisible. She was seen by the landowners as a transient, a person of no consequence, but to the enslaved, she was something else entirely. A listener, a watcher, an unknown quantity moving with a purpose that no one could yet comprehend. Her freedom was her cloak, allowing her to study the men who believed themselves to be untouchable. The Crane ledger contains no narrative, no confession, only the cold, hard list of names. It is a document of profound and silent intent. Historians who have studied it note the precision of the script, the lack of any tremor or hesitation in the ink. This was not a plan conceived in a moment of passionate rage. It was a calculated, methodical ledger of debt. Each name represented an account to be settled, a life to be balanced. The book itself, small enough to be concealed in the palm of a hand, was a portable tombstone, a private declaration of war against the men who had built their world upon the ruins of her own. A war she would wage alone. The atmosphere of 1857 was already thick with tension. Rumors of abolitionist movements in the North and the constant simmering threat of revolt created a paranoid siege mentality among the planter class. They saw conspiracies in every gathering of enslaved people, heard rebellion in every whispered song. They fortified their homes, organized patrols, and doubled down on the brutality that they believed was necessary for their survival. They were looking for an army, for a fire on the horizon. They never thought to look at the quiet woman mending a shirt in the corner of the room, the one with calm eyes who missed nothing, who was not planning a rebellion, but an execution. The official history of Jefferson County for that year records crop yields, land sales, and the weather. It speaks of a prosperous and orderly society. But hidden within the margins of this history is another story, one told through the panicked private letters of men who were watching their world unravel. They write of a sickness, a plague of fear that began in the spring of that year. They speak of men dying in their sleep for no reason doctors could explain. This disconnect between the public record and the private terror is where the story of Marisol Crane truly begins, in the space between the official lie and the whispered, horrific truth. The ledger is a map of her journey, a chronicle of her pain. Each name struck through marks a station on a pilgrimage of vengeance. To understand what happened in 1857, we must follow that map, name by name, death by death. We must reconstruct the story from the fear she left in her wake, and from the silent, admiring testimony of those who knew what she was doing, and who, by their silence, became her willing accomplices. Her targets were not random. They were chosen with the precision of a master strategist. They were the 17 pillars of a cruel world, and she intended to bring them all down. The final entry in the book is simply the last name, struck through just like the others. There is no final note, no statement of victory or exhaustion. The work was simply done. This silence is perhaps the most chilling part of the artifact. It suggests a person for whom vengeance was not a release of emotion, but the completion of a solemn duty. The ledger was closed, the accounts were settled, and Marisol Crane stepped back into the shadows of history, leaving behind only a list of dead men and a legend that would outlive them all, a dark story of a woman who became justice itself. The first name on the list in the Crane ledger provides the key to understanding the entire sinister pattern. John Peterson, Briarwood Plantation, April 1857. The official record of his death is a model of deliberate obfuscation. The Jefferson County coroner, a man who was himself a plantation owner, listed the cause as natural apoplexy, a sudden bleeding within an organ. The report notes that Peterson, a man known for his robust health and violent temper, was found deceased in his bed. It explicitly states there were no signs of forced entry to his quarters, no evidence of a struggle, and nothing stolen. In the eyes of the law, the case was closed before it was ever truly opened. A man had simply died. However, a private letter sent by the owner of Briarwood Plantation, Thomas Ames, to his brother in Savannah tells a far different and more terrifying story. The letter, dated April 14, 1857, was never meant for public view. Ames writes not of a peaceful death, but of a scene of profound and unsettling stillness. He describes finding Peterson with a single, clean cut across his throat, a wound so precise it looked as if it had been made by a surgeon's scalpel. There was surprisingly little blood. The bedsheets were barely disturbed. Peterson lay as if he was still asleep, a man who had passed from life to death without ever waking. Ames's letter reveals the first seeds of paranoia that would soon consume the entire region. He confides in his brother that the most disturbing part was not the death itself, but the reaction of the enslaved people on his plantation. He had expected fear, or perhaps even sullen satisfaction. Instead, he found an unnerving calm, a collective and silent impassivity that he interpreted as a shared secret. "It is as if they all know," he wrote, "but their faces are stone." This silence was more terrifying to him than any open act of rebellion, suggesting a conspiracy that operated just beyond his sight, a mystery he could not penetrate. In that same letter, Ames mentions, almost as an afterthought, the recent hiring of a free woman of color to work in the plantation's laundry. He describes her as quiet, diligent, and possessing a disarming beauty. He notes that she had only been at Briarwood for 2 weeks. On the morning John Peterson's body was discovered, the woman was gone. She had vanished as silently as she had arrived, leaving behind a neatly folded pile of linens and not a single clue as to her identity or her destination. Ames does not connect the two events directly. The thought was too radical, too impossible for a man of his station to contemplate. But the juxtaposition hangs in the air, a question he is too afraid to ask. This first incident establishes the chillingly effective modus operandi that would be repeated 16 more times. Marisol Crane's method was not one of brute force, but of psychological infiltration. She would arrive at a plantation, taking on a menial role that granted her access to the community's inner workings, while simultaneously rendering her invisible to the eyes of power. She was the laundress, the cook, the seamstress, a fixture of the domestic landscape, a person to be ordered around and then immediately forgotten. This anonymity was her greatest weapon, allowing her to observe the routines, habits, and vulnerabilities of her target without arousing the slightest suspicion. The death of John Peterson was a statement. He was a man infamous for his cruelty, a man whose name was a curse in the slave quarters. His sudden, silent end was not seen by the enslaved as a crime, but as a form of divine intervention, a long-awaited act of judgment. The lack of a struggle suggests an almost supernatural element, as if the killer had simply willed him to die. This perception was crucial. Marisol was not merely killing men, she was dismantling the myth of their invincibility. She was proving that even the most feared and powerful among them were vulnerable, that they could be reached even in the supposed safety of their own beds. The local authorities, when quietly informed of the true nature of Peterson's death, chose to uphold the official lie. To admit that an overseer could be murdered so easily in his own quarters on a locked-down plantation would be to admit a catastrophic failure of control. It would sow fear among the white population and, more dangerously, plant ideas of rebellion among the enslaved. And so, the truth was deliberately buried under a fiction of natural causes. This decision, intended to maintain order, would have the opposite effect. By refusing to acknowledge the killer, they allowed her to move on to her next target, unimpeded and unknown. Marisol's disappearance from Briarwood was as calculated as the act itself. She did not flee in a panic. She simply completed her work and moved on, melting back into the landscape of the Georgia countryside. Her movements were precise, leaving no trail for anyone to follow. She understood that the system's own prejudices were her shield. No one would ever suspect a lone black woman was capable of such a cold and audacious act. Their imaginations were limited by their own bigotry, and in that blind spot, Marisol found the freedom to continue her macabre and righteous work, her list in hand, ready to cross off the next name. The story of what happened at Briarwood Plantation became a whispered legend in the slave quarters across the county. It was a story of a phantom, an avenging angel who had come to deliver justice. It was a story that gave hope to the powerless and instilled a new kind of fear in the powerful. The anomaly of John Peterson's death was not recorded in any official history, but it marked the beginning of a reign of terror and a season of reckoning, orchestrated by a killer whose existence the world was not yet ready to believe was possible, a dark American crime in the making. After the death of John Peterson, a terrifying pattern began to emerge, a string of macabre mysteries that followed the very order of the names in the Crane ledger. The second name was Robert Carlyle, an overseer on a cotton plantation in Burke County, known for working his people to the point of collapse. 2 weeks after Peterson was found, Carlyle met the same fate. He was discovered in his bed, the same surgically precise wound across his throat, the same look of placid surprise on his face. Once again, the local doctor declared the cause of death to be a sudden seizure, a fiction that was becoming increasingly difficult for the local gentry to accept. The third name, Silas Thorne, followed in May. Thorne was the overseer of a rice plantation near the Savannah River, a man whose cruelty was a matter of local legend. His death was identical to the others. By this point, the whispers among the plantation owners had grown into a frantic, paranoid clamor. Private letters from this period, many of which are now held in university archives, reveal a community gripped by a growing dread. They write of a phantom killer, a night demon, that could pass through locked doors and guarded gates. They began to see conspiracy everywhere, suspecting their own house slaves of harboring a terrible secret. The fourth name on the list was Amos Fry, and his death marked a turning point. Fry was not just cruel. He was a man who took a particular pleasure in the psychological torment of those under his control. He was found in early June. After his body was discovered, the facade of natural causes finally collapsed. The landowners could no longer sustain the lie. They admitted to themselves and to each other in hushed tones that they were being hunted. The news, carefully guarded at first, inevitably leaked, and a wave of terror washed over the white population of both counties. They were facing a silent, invisible, and ruthlessly efficient serial killer. The accumulation of these identical crimes created an atmosphere of pure horror. The killer left no clues, no fingerprints, no footprints, no murder weapon. The only constants were the method and the target. Always an overseer, always a man known for his brutality, and always in his own bed. The sheer audacity of the acts was baffling. These were not men who lived unguarded lives. They were the enforcers of a police state, surrounded by people who both feared and hated them. That the killer could move among them with such impunity suggested a level of skill and planning that was almost superhuman. The legend of the Black Widow began to take shape in these months of fear and confusion. The name itself seems to have originated from the slave quarters, a description whispered in awe and reverence. It spoke to the killer's method of seduction and betrayal, the way she seemed to draw these men into a fatal intimacy before destroying them. The landowners heard the term and, in their terror, adopted it, imagining a monstrous supernatural seductress, a Lilith born of the swamp rather than a flesh-and-blood woman. The myth was easier to confront than the terrifying reality that one of the people they considered less than human was outthinking and outmaneuvering them all. The evidence of this period is not found in police reports, for there were none. It is found in the margins of society, in the frantic diary entries of planters' wives who wrote of sleepless nights and the sound of every creaking floorboard, in the records of gunsmiths who saw a sudden and dramatic increase in the sale of pistols and rifles, and in the sermons of local preachers who began to speak of a darkness that had fallen upon their land, a divine punishment for some unknown sin. The social fabric of the region was beginning to tear, frayed by a fear that had no face and no name. Marisol Crane, meanwhile, continued her work with a terrifying and steady resolve. As the panic grew, her task should have become more difficult. The plantations were on high alert, with armed guards and nightly patrols, but these measures were designed to stop an invading army, not a lone woman who could impersonate a cook or a field hand. Her greatest defense was the color of her skin. In a world that saw her as part of the scenery, she could hide in plain sight, gathering the information she needed, her calm demeanor a perfect mask for the cold fury that fueled her mission. She was a ghost in the machine of the very system she was dismantling. With each name crossed off her list, the legend grew, but the truth remained buried. The authorities were powerless, the planters were terrified, and the enslaved community watched in silent, knowing approval. The accumulation of bodies was not just a series of crimes. It was a narrative, a story being written in blood across the landscape of 2 counties. It was the story of a debt being paid, an account being settled, and no one, it seemed, had the power to stop the hand that held the pen or the razor. The dark story of the Black Widow was just beginning, and many more would die before it ended. By the summer of 1857, with the body count rising and the terror reaching a fever pitch, the powerful landowners of Burke and Jefferson counties could no longer afford to remain idle. Their inability to comprehend the nature of the threat led them to a conclusion born of their deepest fears and prejudices. They could not conceive of a single individual, much less a black woman, carrying out such a campaign. Therefore, they decided they must be facing a massive, coordinated and brilliantly concealed slave revolt. The killings were not the work of one person, but the opening salvos of an impending race war, an American crime of unimaginable proportions. This hypothesis is laid bare in the minutes of a series of secret meetings held at the Jefferson County Courthouse in July of that year. These documents, preserved by the Clark's family and donated to the state archives in the early 20th century, record the formation of a vigilante group calling itself the County Safety Patrol. At its head was Elias Vance, one of the wealthiest and most influential planters in the region, a man whose name, unbeknownst to him, was the last on Marisol Crane's list. Vance argued forcefully that the Phantom Killer was a fiction, a cover for a network of slave conspirators moving between plantations. The patrol's records detail their strategy, which was not one of investigation, but of brutal suppression. They believed that the conspiracy's secrets could be extracted through force. They drew up lists of suspect slaves, typically those who showed signs of intelligence, leadership, or defiance. These individuals were to be rounded up and subjected to rigorous interrogation, a euphemism for torture. The minutes speak coldly of the need to make an example of a few in order to break the will of the many. They were preparing to fight a war against an enemy that did not exist, blinded by their own racist ideology. The irony of their hypothesis is profound. While Elias Vance and his men were hunting for a vast network of male conspirators, the true killer, a lone woman, was likely moving freely among them, perhaps even serving them food or mending their clothes. Marisol Crane was so far outside the bounds of their imagination that she was functionally invisible. Their fear of a mass uprising, of an army of black men with axes and torches, prevented them from seeing the quiet, precise, and far more deadly threat that was already inside their homes, a single woman with a razor and a list. The Safety Patrol's actions, as documented in their own records, created a new wave of terror, this one directed at the enslaved population. Men and women were dragged from their cabins at night, questioned brutally, and punished for giving answers that their interrogators did not want to hear. Yet, despite the violence, the wall of silence held firm. No one admitted to knowing anything about the killings. This stubborn refusal to cooperate only confirmed the patrol's suspicions of a widespread plot, driving them to even greater acts of cruelty. They were caught in a feedback loop of their own making, their violence breeding the very silence they sought to break. This flawed hypothesis had a critical, unintended consequence. By focusing their attention on a phantom army, the landowners and their patrol overlooked the simplicity and elegance of Marisol's operation. They fortified their plantations against a siege, posting armed guards at the gates and along the perimeter. But Marisol did not need to breach the gates. She was already inside. She understood the internal geography of the plantation world, the trusted house slave who could leave a door unlatched, the cook who could be persuaded to offer a stranger a meal and a place to sleep. Her conspiracy was one of quiet complicity, not armed rebellion. The primary sources from this period show a complete disconnect between the two realities. The official documents of the Safety Patrol are filled with military language, speaking of insurgents, cells, and enemy combatants. Meanwhile, the oral histories passed down through the families of the enslaved speak of something else entirely. They speak of a single avenging spirit, a woman who moved like a ghost, aided by small, almost invisible acts of kindness and solidarity from those who saw her as their champion. The landowners were preparing for a war, while Marisol was conducting a series of quiet, intimate executions. Elias Vance, in his role as the patrol's commander, became the public face of the hunt. He issued proclamations, offered exorbitant rewards for information, and projected an image of absolute control. Yet his private diary, which was discovered decades later, tells a story of mounting frustration and fear. He could find no evidence of the grand conspiracy he so firmly believed in. The killings continued, unabated and unstoppable. He was a general fighting a war against a ghost, a man slowly realizing that his power, which had always seemed absolute, was utterly useless against an enemy he could not see or understand. Ultimately, the hypothesis of a slave revolt served only to reveal the profound intellectual and moral bankruptcy of the men in power. Their arrogance was their undoing. They looked for a reflection of their own methods, brute force, overwhelming numbers, organized violence, and failed to recognize a form of warfare that was entirely alien to them. Patient, precise, psychological, and waged by a single, determined hand. Their hunt for a phantom army was a wild goose chase that allowed the real killer to continue her work, moving ever closer to the final name on her list, Elias Vance himself. The brutal tactics of the county's safety patrol, born from a flawed hypothesis, did not break the spirit of the enslaved community. Instead, they forged it into a silent, unified front of resistance. The landowners had intended to terrorize the population into submission, to extract a confession that would validate their fears of a mass revolt. But their violence had the opposite effect. It created a social fracture, a hardening of the lines between the oppressors and the oppressed, and in the chasm that opened between them, Marisol Crane found fertile ground for her mission to flourish, transforming her personal vendetta into an invisible movement. This transformation is not documented in the letters of plantation owners, but in the rich tapestry of oral histories recorded decades later. The Works Progress Administration interviews of the 1930s contain numerous accounts from the children and grandchildren of those who lived through the time of the widow. These testimonies, spoken in hushed and reverent tones, describe how the community began to actively, albeit covertly, aid Marisol. Her quest for revenge became their collective cause, a secret war waged not with weapons, but with information, deception, and a profound shared silence that the masters could not penetrate. The assistance was subtle, a series of small, deniable actions that, when woven together, formed a protective web around Marisol. A stable hand, questioned by the patrol about strangers in the area, would conveniently forget seeing a woman walking the road at dusk. A cook, noticing Marisol's interest in the overseer's habits, would offer details unprompted, mentioning his nightly walk or the window he always left ajar. A field hand would use a song, its lyrics coded, to pass a message from one plantation to the next, warning of the patrol's movements. These were not acts of a formal conspiracy. They were spontaneous gestures of solidarity, a quiet rebellion of 1,000 small kindnesses. Marisol, in turn, became more than just an avenger. She evolved into a symbol of justice, a living embodiment of a power that the enslaved had never been allowed to possess. Her actions spoke to a deep, unspoken yearning for retribution. She was doing what every man and woman in the fields dreamed of, but dared not attempt. To protect her was to protect a part of themselves, to keep alive the possibility that the scales of justice could in fact be balanced. Her survival became synonymous with their own hope for a world where their suffering was not without consequence, where their pain would be answered. This silent alliance created a stark social fracture. On one side were the white landowners and overseers, isolated by their fear and paranoia, increasingly distrustful of everyone around them, including each other. They lived in a state of self-imposed siege, their world shrinking to the confines of their fortified homes. On the other side was the enslaved community, bound together by a shared secret and a common purpose. They moved through their daily tasks with an outward demeanor of submission, while inwardly they were participants in a righteous crusade, their silence a powerful and defiant weapon. The records of the Safety Patrol inadvertently bear witness to this fracture. Elias Vance's reports grow increasingly desperate. He writes of the impenetrable wall of silence he encounters everywhere. He describes interrogations where men and women endure horrific abuse without uttering a single word that could betray the cause. He cannot understand the source of their loyalty, attributing it to some kind of primitive tribalism or fear of the killer. He never considers the possibility that their silence is not born of fear, but of love and reverence for the woman they were protecting. The moral weight of this period is immense. The enslaved community, by choosing to protect Marisol, became complicit in her actions. They were not merely passive observers, they were active enablers of her violent campaign. This decision carried an enormous risk. Anyone caught aiding the Black Widow would have faced certain and excruciating death. Yet, as the oral histories attest, it was a risk they were willing to take. The justice Marisol offered was a more potent force than the fear of punishment the masters wielded. It was a spiritual rebalancing of a world that had been thrown violently off its axis. The fracture also revealed the true nature of power on the plantation. The masters believed their power was absolute, derived from ownership, wealth, and the threat of violence. But Marisol and her silent allies demonstrated a different kind of power, the power of collective knowledge, of shared secrets, of communal will. They proved that the system was utterly dependent on the coerced cooperation of the enslaved. Once that cooperation became a conscious and strategic act of deception, the system itself began to falter, its foundations eaten away from within by the very people it was designed to control. Thus, the story of the Black Widow ceases to be the story of a lone serial killer. It becomes the story of a community's righteous fury, channeled through a single extraordinary vessel. Marisol Crane was the hand that held the razor, but the will that guided her, the intelligence that shielded her, and the silence that protected her belonged to a people who had decided in their own quiet way that they had had enough. The social fracture was complete, and from it a new and terrifying form of justice had been born. For decades, the story of the Black Widow remained a legend, a piece of folklore with no concrete evidence to support it. The official history held fast to its narrative of unexplained deaths and slave revolt paranoia. But in 2004, during the archival processing of a collection of papers from a prominent Philadelphia abolitionist family, a document was discovered that transformed the legend into verifiable history. It was a letter dated October 1857 from a Quaker activist named Samuel Tilden, who had been secretly operating in Georgia. The letter, written in a complex code, had been intercepted by pro-slavery authorities at the time, but they had been unable to decipher its meaning. Using modern cryptographic analysis, historians finally unlocked its secrets. The letter was a report from Tilden to his abolitionist contact, detailing his clandestine meeting with a woman he referred to by the code name Nightingale. The details he provides leave no doubt that Nightingale was Marisol Crane. He confirms that she was a single operative, that her targets were exclusively brutal overseers, and that her mission was one of personal vengeance. The letter provided the first irrefutable contemporary proof that the Black Widow was not a myth, but a real woman engaged in a calculated campaign of assassination. The most impactful part of the letter is the section where Tilden recounts the story Marisol told him, the story that explained the genesis of her list. He writes that her entire family, her husband, her 2 young sons, and her sister, had been captured together during an escape attempt several years prior. As punishment and to recoup the financial loss, their owner sold them off one by one. Her husband and sons were sent to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, a virtual death sentence. Her sister was sold to Amos Fry, the 4th name on Marisol's list, a man known for his depraved and cruel treatment of women. Marisol was the only one kept behind, forced to watch as her world was systematically dismantled. Tilden's letter provides a harrowing second-hand account of what happened to Marisol's sister, Sarah. Marisol had learned, through the secret communication network of the enslaved, that Sarah had been subjected to unspeakable abuses at Fry's hands. After months of torment, she took her own life. This detail, conveyed in Tilden's spare and heartbroken prose, reframes Marisol's entire mission. She was not just avenging an abstract injustice. She was hunting the specific men responsible for the destruction of every person she had ever loved. Each name on the list was a link in the chain of her family's annihilation. The documented impact of this revelation on the historical understanding of the case was seismic. It stripped away the supernatural folklore and replaced it with a story of profound and understandable human rage. Marisol Crane was no longer a demon or a phantom. She was a wife and a mother, a sister and a survivor who had endured an unimaginable trauma and had responded by channeling her grief into a focused and lethal weapon. Her actions, while violent, were now cast in the light of a righteous, if terrifying, quest for justice in a world where no other form of justice was available to her. This was not the story of a serial killer, but of a one-woman army waging a war of retribution. The letter also confirms the existence of Marisol's support network. Tilden writes that he was able to meet with her only through the careful coordination of several enslaved people who guided him through the backwoods and swamps to a secret rendezvous point. He describes their reverence for her as something akin to religious awe. They called her the Deliverer. This corroborates the WPA oral histories and solidifies the understanding that her campaign was actively supported by the community she was fighting for. She was their avenging angel, and they were her earthly protectors. The discovery of the Tilden letter had a profound impact on the descendants of the families involved, both white and black. For the descendants of the planter class, it was a confrontation with a buried and horrific truth about their ancestors' world. For the descendants of the enslaved, it was a powerful validation of the stories that had been passed down through their families for generations. It proved that their oral history was not myth, but a faithful record of a truth that the official documents had tried to erase. The hidden history was finally brought into the light. Samuel Tilden's letter ends on a note of deep moral ambiguity and personal anguish. He expresses his profound admiration for Marisol's courage and strategic brilliance, but as a Quaker committed to nonviolence, he is deeply troubled by her methods. "She is doing the Lord's work with the devil's tools," he writes. "I pray for her success, but I fear for her soul." This sentiment captures the complex moral weight of Marisol's story. She was a hero born of tragedy, a killer forged by injustice, a figure who complicates our understanding of right and wrong, and whose actions force us to ask what we might become in the face of absolute evil. With this irrefutable evidence, the academic and public perception of the Black Widow case shifted forever. The story was no longer a regional ghost story, but a significant, if brutal, chapter in the history of resistance to slavery. It became a case study in how individuals, stripped of all legal and social power, could nonetheless seize agency and enact their own form of terrible, final justice. The letter did not just solve a historical mystery, it gave a voice to Marisol Crane, allowing her, after more than a century of silence, to finally explain why she did what she did and what this dark American crime was all about. By the autumn of 1857, the sustained and invisible terror campaign waged by Marisol Crane had begun to achieve an effect far greater than the simple elimination of her targets. It had started to cause the systemic collapse of the very authority that governed the plantation world. The overseer was the linchpin of the entire brutal system, the physical embodiment of the master's power. As these men continued to die in the one place they should have been safest, a deep and corrosive fear spread through their ranks, leading to a crisis of control that rippled across the entire region. This was a new, insidious front in the ongoing war. Plantation records from this period, typically focused on crop yields and expenditures, begin to show a new and alarming trend. There is a dramatic spike in entries detailing the hiring of new overseers. The turnover rate, once stable, became a revolving door. Men would take the job, lured by the high pay offered by desperate planters, only to abandon their posts weeks or even days later, often leaving in the middle of the night without a word. The position of overseer, once a symbol of power and authority, had become a death sentence, and few were willing to accept the risk. The personal diaries of plantation owners and their wives document this collapse in vivid detail. They write of the difficulty of finding men willing to take the job, and of the poor quality of those they could hire, often drunkards or drifters who were ineffective and unreliable. The authority of the master class was eroding. They could no longer count on their enforcers to maintain order. A diary entry from the wife of a prominent landowner in Burke County reads, "Mr. Henderson left us this morning. That is the third man in as many months. The fields are in disarray, and the people are growing insolent. This dark terror has undone us." This breakdown of authority had a direct and liberating effect on the enslaved population. With the overseers either dead, terrified, or incompetent, the brutal daily regimen of the plantation began to slacken. The oral histories describe this period as a breathing time, a brief respite from the relentless cruelty that had defined their lives. The pace of work slowed. Punishments became less frequent and less severe. People found small pockets of freedom and autonomy that had been unthinkable just months before. Marisol was not just killing their tormentors, she was indirectly loosening their chains. At the center of this storm was Elias Vance, the commander of the now ineffectual safety patrol. His own authority was collapsing most spectacularly of all. His men, mostly other overseers and the sons of planters, were growing increasingly reluctant to patrol at night. They feared the swamps, the dark roads, and the unseen killer who moved through them. Vance's proclamations, once issued with arrogant confidence, now read like desperate pleas for order. He was a general whose army was deserting him, a leader who had lost the confidence of his followers and, more importantly, his own nerve. The diary of Vance's wife, Eleanor, provides a chilling portrait of his psychological unraveling. She writes of a husband consumed by paranoia, a man who saw threats in every shadow. He had iron bars installed on the windows of their bedroom. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow and would wake at the slightest sound, convinced the Black Widow had come for him. The man who had set himself up as the region's protector was now a prisoner in his own home, tormented by the ghost of a woman he could not find, a woman whose name he did not even know was on a list waiting for him. The collapse was not just practical, it was ideological. The entire worldview of the planter class was predicated on the belief in their own inherent superiority and their absolute right to control the lives of others. The Black Widow shattered this illusion. She proved that their power was not absolute, that their control was a fragile construct that could be broken by a single, determined individual. This realization was, for them, a form of psychological terror more profound than the fear of physical violence. It was the terror of seeing their world, which they believed to be divinely ordained, revealed as a hollow and vulnerable sham. The consequences of this collapse were far-reaching. As word of the haunted counties spread, the value of land and property began to decline. Some families, unable to maintain control over their plantations or endure the constant fear, sold their holdings at a loss and moved away. The economic engine of the region, driven by the brutal efficiency of the overseer system, began to sputter and stall. The social order was being upended, not by an army with torches, but by a series of precise, silent, and terrifying whispers in the dark. A cruel story with a dark ending. Ultimately, the authority of the masters rested on a single unspoken premise: that the consequences for defiance would always be greater than the rewards. Marisol Crane systematically inverted that equation. She demonstrated that there was a consequence for the cruelty of the oppressors, a price to be paid for their sins. In doing so, she broke not only their bodies, but the spell of fear that had held an entire people in bondage. The collapse of their authority was the inevitable result. A new power was rising from the slave quarters, and its instrument was the Black Widow. The methodical progression of Marisol Crane's vengeance continued through the late summer and into the fall of 1857. With each new name crossed off her list, the fear in the hearts of the remaining targets intensified, and the legend of the Black Widow grew more potent. By October, she had reached the 16th name, a man named Jacob Moore, the overseer of a small but notoriously brutal indigo plantation nestled deep in the cypress swamps of Jefferson County. His death followed the now familiar, terrifying pattern, but what Marisol discovered after the act would profoundly alter the final chapter of her mission. This critical discovery is documented in a later, more urgent letter from the abolitionist Samuel Tilden. He writes that after dispatching Moore, Marisol, guided by an intuition born of long and careful study, searched his small, squalid office. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, she found a locked metal box. Inside was a cache of correspondence, letters dating back several years, written to Moore from a single individual. The author of those letters was Elias Vance, the powerful landowner, commander of the safety patrol, and the man leading the hunt for the very killer who now held his private words in her hands. The letters were not about plantation business or the patrols. They were far more personal and far more damning. They were the private communications of a slave trader. The correspondence revealed that Elias Vance, despite his public persona as a respectable gentleman planter, had built his immense wealth not just from farming, but from the domestic slave trade. He was the man who brokered the deals, who moved human property across state lines, who specialized in acquiring problematic slaves and selling them to the harshest plantations in the Deep South. He was a hidden architect of the region's misery. As Marisol read through the letters under the faint light of a purloined candle, the full and horrific picture of her own past finally snapped into focus. The letters detailed the transaction that had destroyed her life. It was Vance who had purchased her entire family after their failed escape. It was Vance who had made the cold, calculated decision to separate them, arguing in a letter to Moore that separating a family unit breaks their spirit and makes them more compliant property. He had treated the annihilation of her world as a simple business strategy, a footnote in a financial ledger. The correspondence revealed something even more sinister. Vance had not just sold her family, he had deliberately distributed them among the very network of overseers whom Marisol was now hunting. He had sold her husband and sons to a buyer connected to a Louisiana sugar plantation, and he had personally sold her sister, Sarah, to Amos Fry. The list of 17 names that Marisol had painstakingly compiled from whispered conversations and painful memories was, in fact, a map of Elias Vance's business dealings. Every man on her list was a client or an associate of the man leading the hunt for her. This discovery was a revelation of shattering significance. Her mission, which she had believed to be a methodical settling of accounts with a series of individual monsters, was now revealed to be something else entirely. She had been, without knowing it, dismantling the entire operational network of a single powerful man. She had been cutting the branches of a poison tree, and now, finally, she had found its root. The 17th and final name on her list, Elias Vance, was not just another target. He was the source, the architect of her pain, the man who had set in motion the entire tragedy. The impact of this hidden source on Marisol must have been profound. Tilden's letter describes her state of mind, as relayed to him by one of her contacts, as a cold and terrible calm. The rage she must have felt was not hot and explosive, but a slow, freezing fire. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Her quest was not just for justice anymore, it was for a final personal confrontation with the man who had authored her suffering. The hunt for the Black Widow and the Black Widow's hunt had now converged on a single, inevitable endpoint: Elias Vance. The letters themselves became a new kind of weapon. They were irrefutable proof of Vance's secret life, a testament to his hypocrisy and his central role in the very system of cruelty Marisol was avenging. They transformed him from a symbol of oppressive authority into a specific, tangible villain, a man whose guilt was now documented in his own hand. For Marisol, these letters were not just evidence. They were a death warrant that Vance himself had signed years ago, a story so terrifying that it had to be true. With this new knowledge, the nature of the final act shifted. It could not be another silent killing in the night. That would be too simple, too merciful. The man who had orchestrated the destruction of her world needed to know who she was and why she had come for him. The final confrontation had to be a reckoning, a moment where the full truth of his actions would be laid bare before him. The discovery of the hidden letters ensured that the end of the story would not be a simple assassination. It would be a final, terrible judgment, a dark and sinister crime about to be repaid in kind. The discovery of Elias Vance's letters transformed Marisol Crane's mission from a campaign of serial vengeance into a singular, focused endgame. The final name on her list was now imbued with a terrible and profound significance. He was the source, the alpha and the omega of her suffering. Samuel Tilden's last known letter concerning the Nightingale, written in the winter of 1857, documents the strategic shift in her planning. It describes a woman who understood that her previous methods of stealth and infiltration would no longer suffice. Vance was not just another overseer, he was the hunter, a man now consumed by the search for her, and his plantation had become a fortress. Tilden's letter, justified by his conversations with Marisol's contacts, explains her reasoning with chilling clarity. She knew that Vance, in his paranoia, would be expecting an attack from the shadows. He would have doubled the guards, barred the windows, and fortified every possible point of entry. To attempt another covert intrusion would be to walk into a prepared trap. Therefore, she decided on a course of action that was as brilliant as it was audacious. She would not try to sneak past his defenses. She would walk directly through his front door in plain sight. She would use his own arrogance and social prejudices as her key. Her plan, as Tilden outlines it, was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. She would no longer be the invisible laundress or the forgotten cook. She would transform herself into someone Vance was culturally and psychologically incapable of seeing as a threat, a woman of his own class. She would arrive at his plantation not as a servant, but as an equal, perhaps a distant relative of a neighboring family or a lady traveling from Charleston who had lost her way. She would rely on her beauty, her intelligence, and her uncanny ability to project an aura of calm confidence to disarm him completely. The justification for this decisive action, as recorded by Tilden, was rooted in a deep understanding of men like Vance. She knew that his entire worldview was built on a rigid hierarchy of race, class, and gender. He could fear a slave revolt or a phantom killer in the night, but the idea that a well-dressed, articulate woman politely asking for shelter could be the very instrument of his demise was a concept that his mind simply could not accommodate. She would exploit his blindness, turning the very foundations of his power, his sense of social superiority, into the weapon of his own destruction, a truly terrifying prospect. The preparations for this final act were meticulous. Through her network, Marisol acquired the necessary attire, a fine dress, gloves, a bonnet, the costume for her performance. She studied the genealogies of the local planter families, gathering the details she would need to make her story plausible. This was no longer just about vengeance. It was about a final, symbolic act of intellectual dominance. She would prove that she could not only outfight him, but outthink him, mastering the codes and customs of his world in order to bring it crashing down upon his head. The suspense in Tilden's final letter is palpable. He describes her plan not as a military strategy, but as a theatrical performance, with Marisol as the playwright, director, and lead actress. The stage would be Vance's own home, the audience an unsuspecting household, and the final act a quiet, intimate moment of retribution. The tension is built through the cold, methodical detailing of her preparations. She was not just planning a murder, she was orchestrating a final, terrible piece of theatre where justice would be the closing line. Tilden's account of her justification reveals a woman in complete control of her destiny and her methods. She understood that to kill Vance as she had the others would be to leave the story unfinished. He had to face his accuser. He had to understand the full scope of his crimes before the end. Her decision to confront him directly was not born of recklessness, but of a profound need for a final moral accounting. She was not just an executioner, she was a judge, and she intended to deliver her verdict to the condemned man's face, a final judgment for this American serial killer. The source also conveys the immense personal risk involved. If her disguise failed, if her nerve faltered for even a moment, she would be unmasked and subjected to a fate too horrific to contemplate. She was walking into the lion's den, armed with nothing but her intellect and her will, but her justification was absolute. Vance was the man who had taken everything from her. His death required a ceremony, a final, intimate dance between the destroyer and the destroyed. She was not just going to kill him. She was going to make him see her, truly see her, before she erased him from the world. The final lines of Tilden's letter serve as a haunting epitaph for the mission. He has done all he can to aid her, and now he can only wait and pray. He writes, "She goes now to face the architect of her sorrow. It is a journey into the heart of darkness, and I do not know if the woman who emerges will be the same one who entered." He understood that this final act was a crucible that would either purify her or consume her soul entirely. The stage was set for the final confrontation, a hidden and dark story about to reach its inevitable, bloody conclusion. The full story of what happened inside Elias Vance's fortified home in the winter of 1857 does not come from the pen of an abolitionist or the diary of a terrified planter. It comes from a source far more intimate and reliable, the deathbed confession of a woman named Hattie, who had been the personal house slave to Vance's wife. In 1902, frail and nearly blind, Hattie gathered her children and grandchildren and recounted the events of those 3 terrifying days. Her story was transcribed by her granddaughter onto the blank pages of the family Bible, a sacred testimony to be preserved for all time. This document is the final primary source, the only eyewitness account of the Black Widow's final act. Hattie's account begins with the arrival of a carriage at the Vance plantation on a cold December afternoon. From it emerged a woman of striking beauty and composure, dressed in the fine but simple attire of a traveling lady. She introduced herself as a distant cousin of a family in Savannah, claiming her own carriage had broken down a few miles down the road. She was so poised, her story so plausible, that Eleanor Vance welcomed her without a moment's hesitation. Elias Vance, despite his legendary paranoia, was equally charmed. Hattie recalls that the master, who had been a nervous wreck for months, seemed to relax in the stranger's presence. She was the one thing he was not looking for. For 3 days, the woman, Marisol, lived as an honored guest in the heart of the enemy's fortress. Hattie's testimony describes her with a sense of awe. She moved through the house with a preternatural calm, engaging Vance in conversations about politics, literature, and farming. She played the piano for the family in the evening. She praised his leadership of the safety patrol, commiserating with him about the terrible phantom that plagued the county. She was, in Hattie's words, playing him like a fiddle, slowly and methodically dismantling his defenses not with force, but with grace and intellect. The interpretation of this period is one of intense psychological suspense. Marisol was studying her prey, learning the rhythms of the house, the placement of the guards, the location of Vance's bedroom. But more than that, she was engaged in a final, cruel act of psychological torment. She was forcing Vance to like her, to trust her, to see her as a peer. She was making him lower his guard completely, all the while knowing she was going to end his life. It was the ultimate assertion of her power over him, a demonstration that she could master not only the tools of violence, but the arts of social deception as well. The climax of Hattie's testimony is both understated and horrific. On the third night, after the family had retired, Hattie was woken by what she described as a single, muffled cry, like a man surprised in his sleep. It was a sound that was over as quickly as it began. She was too terrified to move, and she lay awake until dawn, listening to the silence of the house. The next morning, the strange visitor was gone. Her room was empty, the bed neatly made. It was as if she had never been there at all. When Vance did not come down for breakfast, his wife sent Hattie to wake him. The scene she discovered in the master bedroom is described in the Bible with chilling simplicity. Elias Vance was lying in his bed, his eyes open in a look of final, ultimate surprise. Across his throat was the same clean, precise wound that had marked the Black Widow's other 16 victims. There was no sign of a struggle. The pistol he kept under his pillow had not been fired. He had died without ever having the chance to defend himself. The fortress had been breached not by an army, but by a single, quiet houseguest who had been invited inside. But there was one final detail, a theatrical flourish that sealed the legend. On Vance's chest, placed directly over his heart, was a single sheet of paper. Hattie, who could not read, took it to her husband, who could. It was, he told her, a list of 17 names. All of them, including the name of Elias Vance, had been struck through with a single dark line of ink. Marisol had not just killed him. She had left her signature, the final, irrefutable proof that the phantom he had been hunting and the charming woman he had welcomed into his home were one and the same. She had made him the final punctuation mark in her terrible story. The interpretation of this final act is clear. It was not merely a murder, it was a ritual of closure. By leaving the list, Marisol was ensuring that the truth of what had happened would be known, at least by those in the house. She was claiming her work, taking credit for the systematic destruction of the men who had wronged her. It was an act of supreme confidence and defiance. She had completed her mission, and she wanted the world, or at least the ruins of Vance's world, to know it. She had repaid her family's destruction with the annihilation of his. Hattie's confession, preserved in the sacred space of her family's Bible, is the cornerstone of the Black Widow legend. It is a primary source that validates the oral history and provides the intimate human details that official records could never capture. It's the story of how a woman, armed with nothing but her grief and her intellect, walked into the heart of power and brought it to a silent, bloody and definitive end, closing the book on one of America's darkest and most hidden crime sprees. With the death of Elias Vance, the final name on the list, the reign of terror in Burke and Jefferson counties came to an abrupt and mystifying end. The killings stopped. The Black Widow, having completed her mission, vanished as completely as if the swamps had swallowed her whole. The immediate consequence was a fragile and deeply unsettled calm. The planters and their families were relieved that the murders had ceased, but they were left with a terrifying and unresolved mystery. They never knew who the killer was or why she had stopped. They were left to live with the ghosts of the 17 dead men and the knowledge of their own profound vulnerability. The most significant documented consequence was the dissolution of the county safety patrol. With its leader dead and its mission an abject failure, the vigilante group quietly disbanded. The brutal interrogations ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere of constant surveillance began to lift. The power structure, which had been held together by the authority of men like Vance and his overseers, had been permanently weakened. The system of slavery in the region would, of course, continue until the end of the Civil War, but it would never again operate with the same degree of arrogant, unchallenged confidence. A seed of fear had been planted, a fear that justice in some form was always watching. Marisol Crane disappears from every historical record after the winter of 1857. There is no death certificate, no burial record, no mention of her in the census or any other official document. This total erasure has led to a number of competing legacies. Among the white descendants of the planter class, her story was slowly transformed into a cautionary ghost tale, a local legend used to frighten children into behaving. She became the swamp witch of the Ogeechee, a supernatural boogeyman, stripping her of her humanity and her righteous motive, reducing her incredible story to a mere campfire tale. But among the descendants of the enslaved, her legacy was something far more powerful and sacred. Her story was meticulously preserved through oral tradition, passed down from generation to generation, not as a ghost story, but as a true history of resistance and divine retribution. In these communities, she was not a witch or a demon. She was a hero, a deliverer, a woman who had single-handedly taken on the system and won. She became a powerful symbol of the idea that no injustice is so great that it cannot be answered, that no power is so absolute that it cannot be broken. The legacy of her silent network of allies is also a critical part of the story. The enslaved people who had protected her, who had passed her information and covered her tracks, carried their secret with them for the rest of their lives. Their collective silence was a testament to their loyalty and their shared sense of justice. They had participated in a successful secret war, and their victory was not in a public monument, but in the private knowledge of what they had accomplished. Their legacy is one of silent, effective solidarity, a model of resistance that operated entirely beneath the surface of official history. The physical landscape of the region also bears the scars of her legacy. Many of the plantations where she struck eventually fell into ruin, their owners unable to recover from the economic and psychological devastation of that terrible year. The story of the haunted counties discouraged new investment and settlement for years. In a very real sense, Marisol Crane had poisoned the land for the very people who had stolen it, leaving behind an aura of bad luck and dark memories that lingered for decades. Her vengeance was not just personal, it was economic and geographic. The Crane Ledger, discovered a century later, is perhaps her most tangible legacy. It is the artifact that bridges the gap between folklore and history. It is the silent, unimpeachable witness that proves the oral tradition was true all along. It serves as a powerful reminder that official history is often an incomplete and biased record, and that the most important truths are sometimes hidden in the margins, waiting for a chance to be read. The ledger ensures that Marisol Crane is remembered not as a ghost, but as a real woman who wrote her own story in the blood of her enemies. Ultimately, Marisol's legacy is one of profound moral complexity. She was a killer who sought justice, a victim who became a predator, a hero who employed the tools of terror. Her story resists easy categorization. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable question of what constitutes justice in a world where the law itself is an instrument of oppression. Her actions were brutal, but they were a direct response to a system of brutality that was far greater and more pervasive. She remains a haunting figure in the American consciousness, a testament to the extraordinary and terrifying things that ordinary people can be driven to do when they have nothing left to lose. Her disappearance is the final perfect act in her story. By vanishing, she transcends history and becomes a permanent mythic figure. She is not tied to a grave or a final resting place. She exists forever in the space of possibility, the woman who walked out of the darkness, settled her accounts, and walked back into the darkness, her work complete. Her legacy is not in what she left behind, but in the fact that she was never found. A permanent and unsolvable mystery, a testament to the perfect crime committed in the name of a perfect and terrible justice. The case of Marisol Crane, the Black Widow of Georgia, stands as a chilling testament to the power of a single, focused will against a corrupt and complacent system. An analysis of the available sources, the Crane Ledger, the Tilden Letters, the Vance Family Bible, paints a picture of a woman who was not a monster, but a product of a monstrous world. She was an instrument of a justice so pure and so personal that it bordered on the sublime. Her campaign was not a random spree of violence. It was a surgical, strategic, and deeply symbolic act of moral and spiritual rebalancing. She did not just kill 17 men. She executed a sentence on an entire system of belief. The Crane Ledger itself is the central document, the Rosetta Stone for understanding her mission. Its cold, methodical nature is perhaps its most revealing feature. This was not the work of madness, but of a profound and unshakable sanity. In a world that was fundamentally insane, a world that commodified human beings and justified systemic cruelty, Marisol's actions can be interpreted as a radical act of clarification. She was cutting through the lies, the justifications, and the hypocrisies of the planter class to reveal the simple, brutal truth that lay beneath. Their power was maintained by violence, and it could be dismantled by a more precise and more intelligent form of violence. Her methodology reveals a genius for psychological warfare. She understood that her greatest weapons were the prejudices of her enemies. They could not see her, truly see her, because their worldview made her invisible. She used her race, her gender, and her social status as the perfect camouflage, hiding in plain sight. Her ability to shift her identity, from laundress to seamstress to high society lady, demonstrates a level of adaptability and control that is nothing short of extraordinary. She was a master of masks, a performer in a deadly play of her own devising. The silence of the enslaved community is the other crucial pillar of her success. Their refusal to cooperate with the authorities, even under extreme duress, was not just an act of self-preservation. It was a conscious political and moral choice. They recognized in Marisol's mission a form of justice that the world had always denied them. In protecting her, they were asserting their own agency, their own moral code. Their silence was not passive. It was an active, powerful, and decisive contribution to her war. It was the sound of a people choosing their champion. The open question that remains, however, is what became of Marisol Crane. Her disappearance from the historical record is absolute. Samuel Tilden makes no further mention of her. No record of her has ever been found in the North or in Canada. It is as if, having completed the final act of her terrible drama, she simply walked off the stage of history. This has led to speculation that she may have perished in the swamps while trying to escape. Her body never recovered. It is a plausible, if unsatisfying, conclusion to her story. But there is another more haunting possibility, suggested by a series of anomalies in the records of neighboring counties. In 1858, a year after the killings in Jefferson and Burke stopped, an overseer in Screven County, a man with a reputation for exceptional cruelty, was found dead in his bed, a single clean cut across his throat. In 1859, two more overseers, one in Emmanuel County and another back in Burke, died in the exact same manner. The official causes of death were listed as suicide or accident, the truth once again buried by authorities terrified of admitting the unimaginable. These unsolved cases leave us with a profound and unsettling open question. Did Marisol Crane survive and continue her mission, moving from county to county, a silent, itinerant angel of death, working her way through a new list? Or had her legend become so powerful that it inspired others to take up her methods? Did the Black Widow become not just a person but a title, a mantle passed on to others who sought their own form of justice? Had she, in effect, taught others how to fight back in the same silent, deadly language? We may never know the answer. The truth may be buried forever in the acidic soil of the Georgia swamps, or in the unmarked graves of men whose deaths were never properly investigated. But the uncertainty is, perhaps, the most powerful part of her legacy. It suggests that the spirit of her vengeance did not die with the last man on her list. It lived on, a terrifying and persistent whisper in the ears of the powerful, a reminder that cruelty has consequences, that debt will always be paid, and that justice, once unleashed, does not always stop when the first battle is won. The story of Marisol Crane is a stark reminder that the history we read is never the full story. The most important truths often live in the silences, in the gaps between the official records, and in the legends whispered by those who were denied a voice. Her actions, born of unimaginable pain, remain a terrifying and enduring symbol of resistance, a dark chapter in America's long struggle with its own soul, a mystery that continues to haunt us, asking a question we are still afraid to answer. When all other paths to justice are closed, what is a human being capable of? The stories that history tries to forget are often the ones that reveal the most about who we truly are. They hold a mirror up to the darkness we carry within us, but also to the incredible strength of the human spirit in the face of absolute despair. These truths are not always comfortable, but they are necessary. If you believe in the power of these forgotten narratives, and if you want to continue this journey into the hidden corners of our past, then subscribe to Before the Story. We don't just tell stories, we unearth the truths that have been deliberately buried, because we believe that the past is never truly past, and its lessons are waiting for those who are brave enough to listen. Join us. The next story is waiting.